He stood up in front of the entire town, looked straight at the woman everyone had turned their backs on, and said 4 words that silenced the crowd. "I'll take her." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The woman with the scar on her arm stood there, and like someone who had just been told, for the first time in her life, it was worth choosing. And Thomas Walker, the man who swore he would never love again, had no idea that those 4 words were about to destroy everything he had so carefully built around his broken heart. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow along until the very end. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Thomas Walker had not spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in Willow Creek for the better part of 3 years. That was not an accident. He had made a decision, quiet, deliberate, final, the night they buried Sarah. He had stood at her grave in the freezing Montana wind, hat in his hands, and he had told himself the truth that nobody else was brave enough to say to him. You don't get a second one. Men like you don't get 2. And he had believed it. Every single morning since then, gotten up before dawn, the horses, worked the land until his hands bled, gotten alone at a table meant for 2, and gone to bed without a word spoken to any living soul except his old quarter horse, who at least had the decency not to ask him how he was doing. Willow Creek knew Thomas Walker the way small towns know their quiet men, with a mixture of respect and pity, and just enough distance to make everyone comfortable. They knew he had been something before grief got hold of him. Thomas Walker, who used to laugh loud enough to shake the rafters at Denny's saloon on a Friday night. Thomas Walker, who used to bring Sarah wildflowers on a Tuesday for no reason at all, except that she liked them. Thomas Walker was gone. What remained was a man who did his business and left, had cash, didn't make small talk, and whose eyes had that particular flat quality of someone who had packed everything away and shut the lid tight. He came into town that Saturday morning for nothing more than fence posts and a bag of oats. Not supposed to stay. He had told himself he'd be in and out before the crowd gathered on the square, as that morning was the Willow Creek Community Selection Day, which was a name that made something ugly sound presentable. Thomas despised it. The selection day had started 3 years back as some kind of civic matchmaking event. The older families in the county put their unmarried daughters forward. Eligible bachelors of the surrounding ranches came in to look them over, and matches were made the way cattle were bought and sold at auction. Thomas had never participated. He had watched it happen from a distance the first year, with a cold feeling in his stomach that he couldn't quite name. This year, he had intended to be back on his land before the whole thing started. He was loading the last of the fence posts into the bed of his truck when he heard the murmuring shift in the crowd behind him. A good kind of murmuring, not the excited, anticipatory buzz of people watching something they like. It was lower, harsher, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it has collectively without quite having the honesty to call it that. Thomas did not turn around immediately. He told himself it was none of his business. Himself whatever was happening on that square had nothing to do with him. Up the last post and turned around anyway. There were squares full, maybe 300 people, which was nearly everyone in Willow Creek and the surrounding farms. The men stood on one side in their good boots and their clean shirts, shuffling and looking sideways at each other. The women, the ones who had been brought forward as candidates, stood in a loose line near the old bandstand. Thomas counted 11 women in that line. 10 of them were surrounded by small clusters of conversation. Others adjusting hair. Friends whispering encouragement. Already drifting toward the ones they'd had their eye on. 11th stood alone, not slightly apart, not at the edge of the comfortable social radius. Alone with a clear, deliberate circle of empty space around her. The crowd had agreed, without saying so, that she was the one no one would go near. It was young, mid-20s maybe, brown hair pulled back simply. Her dress was clean and pressed, practical rather than decorative. A dress that said, "I am not trying to impress you, I'm showing up anyway." She held herself straight back tall, but her hands were clasped in front of her with the careful stillness of someone exercising considerable self-control. Her left arm, running from elbow to wrist, was a scar, enough to see from 20 yards, old enough to be silver white in the morning light. Summers apparently was all the crowd needed to know about her. Thomas watched a man, maybe 25, well-dressed, kind of young man who was used to being the most comfortable person in any room, walk toward her section of the line, upon us down as he noticed the scar, and then redirect himself toward the woman 2 places down without breaking his conversational stride, though the course correction had happened entirely on its own. Even with the scar, watched it happen. Her jaw tightened. Wobbers. Then she looked straight ahead again at nothing in particular. Must recognize the expression on her face with an immediacy that hit him somewhere deep in the chest. It was the face of someone who was already used to this, who had made peace with it, not comfortable peace, not happy peace, but the grim, functional peace of a person who has been hurt so many times by the same thing that they have learned to take the blow without flinching. He knew that face. He'd seen it in his bathroom mirror for 3 years. He asked the man standing nearest to him, old Pete Harlow, in the hardware store and knew everything about everyone. Who is she? And Pete glanced over, then away, with the practiced discomfort of a man who'd rather not have the conversation. Amelia Hart, over from the Collins County side. Folks brought her in. I think they hoped. He trailed off. Up what? Pete shifted his weight. Thomas, she's a nice enough girl. I'm sure. But look, nobody's going to... That's not what I asked you, Pete sighed. That scar. She got it when she was young, some kind of accident on the farm. Third, bad one, she's been passed over before. Every time he lowered his voice, as if what he was saying next was a kindness. Her own family doesn't know what to do with her anymore. Thomas looked back at the square. A second man had just detoured away from Amelia without speaking to her. A third, and Amelia Hart stood there and took it back straight, their level, as clasped, and Thomas could see from here the exact moment when the composure started to cost her something. A small tightening around her eyes, a breath that was slightly too slow, of pain that a person has learned to make invisible, but which shows anyway to anyone who knows what to look for. Thomas set down the fence post he hadn't realized he was still holding. He wasn't thinking clearly. He would understand that what happened next was not the product of rational decision-making, but of something older and more instinctive than thought. Across that square, the way a man walks toward a fire that he knows will burn him, because something in the situation is simply wrong. Watching it continue to be wrong is a thing he finds he cannot do. He was halfway across before anyone noticed him. By the time he reached her, the whispers had already started, a low, curious undercurrent running through the crowd. As people noticed, Thomas Walker hadn't participated in a selection day since his wife died, with a purpose none of them could quite account for. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him, dark eyes, thick and intelligent, already guarded in the way of someone who has learned that attention often precedes another disappointment. Walker, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. You know my name, he said. Everyone knows your name. She paused. I assumed you were heading toward Clara Reeves. She's 2 down from me. Most of the men who come in this direction end up turning toward her. It was said without bitterness. That was what struck him. It was simply stated, factually, as though she were describing the behavior of weather. Thomas found that, for the first time in 3 years, I was at a complete loss for what to say. He stood there for a moment that stretched out long enough to make both of them uncomfortable. And then he said the only true thing he had, I'm not heading toward Clara Reeves. A pause. For one. Then what are you heading toward? She asked. He looked at her directly. He looked at her the way he hadn't looked at anything in years, fully the habit of deflection that had become his primary mode of existing. Oh, yet, he said honestly. But I know I'm standing in the right place. The murmuring in the crowd behind him shifted in register. Amelia Hart looked at him for a long moment, and something moved across her face, not hope exactly. As hope was a luxury she had learned to ration carefully. But something adjacent to hope, something that was wondering if it was allowed. There, Walker, she said quietly. Please don't do something out of pity. I would rather stand here alone all day than have someone choose me because they felt sorry for me. She said it with a steadiness that took his breath away. Thomas Walker, who had not felt anything strongly enough to act on in 3 years, said clearly so that she could hear it, and so could every soul in that square. There's her. Take her. Her. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Thomas had heard since the morning after Sarah's funeral. And he'd woken up and the house was quiet in a way it had never been before, and he'd understood there, fully and finally, what the rest of his life was going to sound like. Silence was different. This one had shape and weight, and the particular quality of 300 people simultaneously rethinking something they had already decided. But Amelia did not move. Her eyes were on him, searching. There's serious, trying to read something in his face that would tell her whether this was real. Don't know me, she said. Soft, urgent. No, he agreed. Arad. Then why? It was the fair question, the only question. Thomas stood there in front of the whole town and told her the only answer he had that had walked him across that square without his permission was, you've been standing there all morning, and every man who came close enough to see you found a reason to walk away. I've been watching, and I can't figure out what they saw that I'm not seeing. I can't stand here and keep watching it happen. Her breath caught. Just slightly, just enough for him to notice. That's not a reason to. It's the reason I've got, he said. Honest one. If you want to tell me to walk away, I'll walk away. But I'm not doing it because of what's on your arm. I want you to know that. For a long moment, Amelia Hart did nothing. She looked at him with those careful, measuring eyes. Thomas had the distinct sense that she was performing a rapid and thorough calculation, weighing risk and past experience, weighing the specific texture of his voice against every other voice that had ever offered her something, and then taken it back. Then she said, all right, just that. All right, and the crowd of Willow Creek erupted in celebration, not in the warm approval of people watching something beautiful. It was louder and messier than that, a surge of voices, some astonished, some amused, some openly disapproving. Thomas heard his name spoken in at least a dozen different registers. He heard Amelia's name spoken in ways that made his jaw tighten. He turned around and looked at the crowd for a moment, a long, quiet look that reminded several people at once why Thomas Walker had always a particular kind of authority that was difficult to argue with, and then he turned back to Amelia. Can I take you somewhere quieter? He said. She almost smiled. Almost. That seems like a reasonable idea. He walked beside her, behind her and not in front of her, and the crowd parted, because crowds always part for certainty. Thomas Walker, whatever else had happened to him in the last 3 years, was moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going. They sat on the tailgate of his truck at the edge of the square, and the distance from the crowd felt like breathing again. Amelia said nothing for a while. She looked at her hands. Then she said, I need to understand something. Ask it. You're Thomas Walker. Your wife. Everyone in this county knows that. Everyone knows what happened. She paused. People say you've been closed up for years. What I need to understand is why today? Why me? As if this is some kind of you're doing this because you needed to do something decent and I was convenient. No. Let me finish. Her voice had steel in it. Thomas went quiet. I have been convenient before. I have been chosen before twice, and both times it was because the man who chose me wanted to feel like a good person. I ended up worse off than if I'd stayed alone. I am asking you, directly, to tell me the truth about what you want from this. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He respected the question too much to answer it fast. I want to feel like a good person, he said finally. I haven't wanted to feel like a good person in a long time. I go home. I want to stop sitting at a table by myself every night in a house that's too big for one person and too quiet for a man who used to know what it felt like to have something worth coming home to. He stopped. That's the honest answer. It's not romantic and it's not much. They're to comper, but it's true. Amelia looked at him. Her expression had shifted something harder and more honest in it. It's actually the most truthful thing anyone has ever said to me in one of these situations, she said. Is that good or bad? I'm not sure yet. She looked down at her arm. You're not bothered by it? No. Why not? I've got my own, he said simply. I looked up at him. He put a hand to his chest, briefly, not dramatically, just as a statement of fact. Mine is invisible, but it's there. They talked for another hour about arrangements. Those would, the formalities, with the formalities that the selection day required. The way two people talk when they are both, for different reasons, desperately out of practice at talking to anyone at all, haltingly at first. Then, with increasing directness, as both of them had learned through different experiences, indirect communication was a luxury that got people hurt. She told him about Collins County, about growing up with a family that loved her but didn't know what to do with her parents, who had stopped bringing her to social events after the third time she was passed over, who had started to talk about her future in terms of what was realistic. There was their particular way of asking her to want less. About the farm accident when she was 9, not with emotion, a clean factual delivery of someone who has told the story enough times that the telling no longer requires them to feel it. Her fence, a bad fall, a surgery that saved her arm but left its mark. She told him she had a mind for numbers, that she had kept the accounts for the Collins County feed store for 2 years, that she knew how to ride and how to drive a tractor and how to make a budget stretch further than it wanted to go. Not helpless, she said, and there was something fierce in it. I didn't see that, Thomas said. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me. Good. I'm not in the rescue business. She tilted her head. What business are you in? He thought about it. Fence posts and oats, he paused. But I'm open to renegotiating. It surprised them both, the small sound she made, between a laugh and an exhale, as though something that had been held very tight had briefly loosened. They were still sitting on the tailgate when Richard Caldwell found them. Thomas heard him coming. Caldwell was not a man who moved quietly, not because he lacked the ability, but because he had never seen a reason to. He was a large man with an expensive hat and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his life wanted something he could not eventually acquire. Also wanted Thomas's land, had wanted it for 2 years, had made 3 offers that Thomas had refused with decreasing politeness, while had accepted with the particular graciousness of a man who considers refusal to be a temporary condition. A few feet from the truck and looked at Amelia with an expression that was almost but not quite hidden behind a veneer of social pleasantry. Thomas, he said, with the easy familiarity of a man who believes that his own comfort is automatically shared by the people around him. I don't expect to see you at the selection today. I didn't plan on it, Thomas said. Caldwell's eyes moved to Amelia. And this must be Amelia Hart, she said. Before Thomas could speak, she met Caldwell's gaze directly, warmth, without hostility, with the particular levelness of someone who has already classified the specific type of man and knows exactly what to expect. Caldwell smiled in the way of a man performing a smile for an audience he has decided is below him. Oh, wonderful for you. He looked back at Thomas. Brave choice, Thomas. Generous, there it was, the word, generous. The word that turned a person into a charity. Thomas felt the temperature of his own thoughts drop several degrees. Particularly, he said, his voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. I'm the person I wanted to bring home. That's all. Caldwell's smile remained. Something shifted behind his eyes. Of course, he looked at Amelia again, that same evaluation, that same rapid assessment that filed her away in a category. Labors. I hope you know what you're taking on, young lady. Thomas's ranch is a lot of work. It's been struggling. I hear, Richard, Thomas said quietly. Just being honest. Caldwell raised one hand in a gesture of peace that contained no peace in it whatsoever. If you ever find yourself reconsidering your options, either of you, my door is always open. He looked at Thomas with the particular steadiness of a man stating something that is both an offer and a warning. The land, I mean. The offer stands. He walked away without waiting for a response. That was a habit of his. Amelia watched him go. He wants your land, she said. A question. Has for 2 years. And he's going to use this. She gestured between them. I pressure you. Thomas looked at her. Sharpness of it, the speed with which she had identified exactly what Caldwell was doing, confirmed something he had been thinking since she'd told him she had a mind for numbers. Most likely, he said. And you chose to do something that gives him ammunition? Day of all days, she paused. That wasn't very strategic. No, he agreed. A beat of silence. Why, she said, not accusingly. Only. Thomas looked across the square, where the selection day was wrapping up in its various small negotiations and arrangements. And then he looked back at her. Because some things aren't about strategy, he said. Amelia Hart had told herself the drive to Willow Creek that morning that she was not going to hope. She had given herself that instruction very clearly, the way she gave herself clear instructions before anything that had the potential to hurt. Do not hope, not want, show up, stand straight, and if nothing happens, drive home and let your mother make you tea and do not cry until you're alone. Followed that plan many times. It was a reliable plan. It had kept her functional through situations that might otherwise have destroyed something important. But sitting on this stranger's truck at the edge of a crowd that had, her entire adult life, served primarily as a vehicle for humiliation, sitting here, while this quiet, unmistakably sad man told her that some things weren't about strategy, she felt the plan straining at its seams. I looked at her scar. It was a habit. She'd mostly broken herself of the checking consciousness, but in moments of uncertainty, it resurfaced. I'm going to say you lost your mind, she said. People have been saying that about me for 3 years, for different reasons, Thomas said. I'm used to it. It's going to be hard. Yes. And I'm not going to be grateful and agreeable and easy to manage just because you did something decent. I didn't ask you to be. I'm telling you in advance, she said, because in my experience, men who do something they consider generous often expect a particular kind of return on it. Science. Gratitude. She searched for the word softness. Thomas Walker looked at her steadily. Hart, he said. The last thing I need is someone soft. My house has been soft with silence for 3 years, and it's about to fall in on itself from the quiet. He paused. I need someone real. Whether that's easy or hard is not the point. Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Right, she said. Again and again. Just those 2 words, but this time with something different underneath them. Something that was not quite hope, but that was no longer carefully avoiding it either. Drove to the Walker Ranch as the afternoon light stretched long and amber across the Montana hills, and neither of them spoke much on the way. Not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood independently and without discussion. However, they were each processing something large and unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. Thomas, it was the sensation of having made a decision, a real one, consequential and irreversible for the first time since Sarah died. Every choice in the last 3 years had been small and contained. Our horse, fix this fence, buy these posts, drive home. Absence of large decisions had been, he understood now, a deliberate retreat, a way of keeping his world small enough that nothing in it could hurt him again. He had just blown that open. For Amelia, it was the recognition that this truck, this man, this road were all entirely unknown variables, and that she had said all right twice to a stranger with sad eyes and a quiet certainty, plus duct tape on the corners, and that she had done it because something in her had decided without consulting her more careful self that those sad eyes were telling the truth. She had been wrong about that before. She knew she had been wrong about that before. She had also learned the specific cost of letting fear make every decision for her. Cost, worn over years, had its own kind of damage. Which came into view as the road curved. She looked at it through the windshield, the house, buildings, the pasture fences, the horses moving slow and easy in the late afternoon. It was not small. It was not in disrepair, despite what Caldwell had implied. The particular look of a place maintained by someone who was keeping things functional without much interest in making them beautiful. Like the house of a man who had stopped expecting company. She felt something she had no name for, not belonging, yet nothing so presumptuous as that, but the beginning of a question. Just be something? She didn't answer the question. She was too experienced in the dangers of premature answers. She let herself ask it. Thomas parked the truck and they sat for a moment in the settling quiet of the engine going still. I'll show you around, he said. All right, she said. Third time. And they got out. And the door of the truck closed with a solid sound behind her. And Amelia Hart stood on the land of Thomas Walker and looked around at all of it, at the honest, unvarnished, difficult reality of the life she had just, against every plan, walked into. And somewhere deep in her chest, behind 3 years of careful armor and 2 failed promises and a scar that had defined her in the eyes of everyone who ever looked at it, something very small, nervous and very stubborn and very much alive decided to stay. The first night was the hardest, not because anything went wrong, because nothing went wrong at all, and that somehow was worse. Thomas had shown her the spare room, one at the end of the hall, that had functioned as a storage space for the better part of 2 years, and which he had cleared out that afternoon with a speed and a silence that communicated everything he was unwilling to say out loud. Clean sheets, a lamp that worked, a window that faced east so the morning light came in early. Touch, he said, standing in the doorway. It's, Leah said, standing in the middle of the room, taking stock of it the way she took stock of everything practically. Sentimentality. Bathrooms across the hall. Up at 4:30. You don't have to be. What time does the work start? He paused. 5. Then I'll be up at 4:30, she said. At her. She looked back, and they stood there in the doorway of a small spare room in a big quiet house, and understood of them simultaneously that they had no idea how to do this, not the ranch work or practical arrangements, but the larger, stranger thing of simply being in the same space as another person without flinching. All right, Mr. Walker, she said. Thomas, he said. See, I'm gonna live in the same house. You can use my name. A pause. Good night, Thomas. He nodded once and pulled the door closed. And Amelia listened to his footsteps going down the hall. The particular silence of the house reasserted itself, that deep, structural quiet that told her this place had been empty of real human sound for a very long time. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands and said, under her breath, nobody. What did you just do? Amelia. It was not a question, it was a verdict. And she sat with it for a long time before she finally lay down, dressed, and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out whether the thing she was feeling was fear or something else entirely. She decided she'd figure it out in the morning. Morning came before she was ready for it. She heard him moving at 4:28, not an alarm. Just a man waking up because his body had been trained to do it, full of boots on hardwood, the low sound of the kitchen functioning. When she got there, the coffee was already made. Thomas was standing at the counter reading something on a folded piece of paper that he put away when she walked in. You don't have to help, he said without looking up from his coffee. I would. You said you'd be up at 4:30. I didn't take that as a commitment. When I say something, it's a commitment. And she said it simply as a boast, just as a statement of how she worked. Get herself coffee. What needs doing first? A beat. Something shifted in his face too small and too fast for her to read clearly. Horses. Then the east fence line. Caldwell's cattle keep testing it. Show me the fence line, she said. I'll walk it while you do the horses. You know fence work? I grew up on a farm. I know fence work. He looked at her, then really looked the way he'd looked at her in the square, direct and assessing and without the social habit of looking away. He got his jacket off the hook by the door and handed her the spare one, heavier, his, sized for a man's shoulders without comment. It swallowed her. She rolled the sleeves up and went out the door ahead of him. And she was almost certain she heard something that might have been the very beginning of a sound in his throat. A laugh. Not quite. Something smaller and less familiar to him. She kept walking. The fence line was worse than he'd indicated. Posts down, wire pulled loose over a 20-yard section of ongoing damage that spoke of either persistent cattle or deliberate interference. Amelia walked the whole length of it before Thomas finished with the horses and found her crouching at the worst section, testing the tension in the wire with practiced hands. Sir, this didn't happen by accident, she said when she heard his boots behind her. Oh, he said. How long has Caldwell been doing this? Silence. Well, then, I didn't say it was Caldwell. She stood up and looked at him. You didn't have to. You said his cattle keep testing it. Well, don't test fences on their own. They go where the wire is already loose. She looked back at the post. Was pulled. You can see it in the ground. It didn't break. It was levered out. Someone came and did this by hand. Thomas was quiet for a moment in a way that told her she was right and that he had known she was right and that he had been carrying it alone for a while. That's the land, she said. Yes. And he's been trying to drive your costs up. Pulls the fences, let the cattle through. You spend money fixing it instead of... She stopped. How much do you owe on this land, Thomas? The question landed hard in the set of his jaw. That's not my business, she said, unkindly but firmly. You brought me here. This is my house now, too. If there's something coming at it, I need to know. Another long silence. A magpie called somewhere above them. The wire fence clicked faintly in the wind. Off, he said finally. I owe enough. Last year was bad drought, took most of the summer grazing. High feed, the margin got thin. He paused. Caldwell knows. Somehow he always knows. Amelia looked at the pulled fence post for a long moment. He's waiting for you to run out of room, she said. Orders. And then he's going to make you an offer you can't refuse. Call it a favor. Thomas said nothing. It was its own kind of answer. We're not going to let that happen, she said. Well, he blinked. She repeated, meeting his eyes. I told you I have a mind for numbers. I kept accounts for 2 years. I can look at what you've got and what you owe and figure out where the air is. I need you to show me the books. All of them. Not the version you'd show a bank. Thorough one. Thomas Walker stood in the cold morning air and looked at this woman who had been in his house for less than 12 hours. Who was wearing his jacket with the sleeves rolled up and had just accurately diagnosed his financial situation from a broken fence post, something he had not expected to feel this soon or possibly ever. Useful, he felt genuinely, practically useful again. As a rescuer, as a partner. All right, he said. And Amelia looked at him and felt the word come back to her own word, and she'd given him twice the day before and recognized it now as the beginning of something that was not temporary. Help me pick up the fence post. Help me get this back in, she said. Then we'll look at the books. They worked the fence line for 2 hours. Side by side, much conversation in that silence, the functional, full silence of two people doing physical work together. Something settled between them. Warmth yet, not trust. But the beginning of what trust is built on, the college, the person next to you is showing up. It was not nothing. By the time they got back inside and Amelia sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers open in front of her, she had already begun arranging the problem in her mind, the way she arranged everything methodically. Panic, looking for where the numbers could be moved. Thomas sat across from her and watched her read with an expression that was doing something complicated. Look surprised, she said, without looking up. Not surprised. You are. You thought you'd have to explain it to me. I thought it might take longer, he admitted. Yes. She looked up. I can see 3 places in this ledger where you're paying twice for the same service under different account names. That's either sloppy bookkeeping or someone has been overcharging you for long enough that it became invisible. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. This feed supplier, you're paying 2 invoices, every quarter one to Walker Ranch account, a T. Walker personal, same supplier, same delivery address. Authorize that? He stared at the page. No, he said slowly. He paused. I've been using Hargrove's feed. Harlow set up the account when Sarah was sick, paying close attention to. He stopped. Someone has been running a double billing for how long? He took the ledger and traced backward. His face changed as he counted, went still, and hard in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This one had something hot underneath it. 18 months, he said. How much? He did the arithmetic. There, said the number. Amelia kept her face neutral, but her jaw tightened. An accident, she said. That's a calculation. Decided what amount you'd be unlikely to notice immediately, but would feel over time. Hargrove, Thomas said. It came out flat and cold. Who introduced you to Hargrove? The silence was answer enough. Caldwell, she said. Thomas closed the ledger with a sound like a door shutting. He sat very still for a moment, and Amelia recognized the quality of that stillness. It was a man containing something large, knowing where to put it. Thomas, she said carefully, don't go to Hargrove today. I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it. He looked at her. Oh, what I'm thinking. I know what that look means, she said. I've seen it before. A man finds out he's been cheated, and his first instinct is to go find the person who cheated him and have it out. She paused. That's exactly what Caldwell would want. It gives him grounds. It makes you the problem. A long moment. What would you do? He said. There was genuine curiosity in it, not the rhetorical question of a man who has already decided, the real question of someone who is, for the first time in a long time, to consider another answer. Document it, she said. Every invoice for the last 2 years. Make a ledger of exactly what was billed versus what was delivered. Then you have something real, something a bank will look at, a court will look at. She leaned forward slightly. Caldwell thinks he's got you squeezed. Let him think that a little longer while we figure out exactly how much he's taken and how to get it back. Thomas looked at her across the kitchen table. The burning light was full now. The coffee had gone cold in both their mugs. Outside, one of the horses was calling from the pasture in the uncomplicated, insistent way of animals who trust that someone will answer. This before, he said, dealt with people like him. The man who ran the Collins County feed store, she said, before my employer. He had a supplier arrangement that was bleeding the store for 4 years before anyone caught it. She paused. I was 22. They didn't believe me at first because I was 22, and they'd been running that store for 40 years. She met his eyes. I showed them the numbers. Numbers don't have opinions about your age. Something in Thomas's face went quiet in a new way, not the closed-off quiet, not grief quiet, but the quiet of recognition, of being seen by someone who was paying real attention. Why were you at the selection day? He said, and it came out like a question he'd been holding. A woman who can do what you just did, you didn't need that. What? She said, and there was something careful in the way she said it. I have done, Thomas. I could have kept the accounts at the feed store until they decided to promote the owner's nephew instead. I've gone back to my parents' house and helped my mother with her garden and been grateful for what I had. She looked at the ledger. Election day was my family's idea. A good one, a practical solution to a practical problem. She paused, and when she spoke again, it was quieter. I went because I was running out of other options, not because I had none. Because the ones I had were very small, smaller. He was quiet. Then I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, she said immediately. I'm not telling you for that. I'm telling you so you understand what I'm actually capable of and why I'm here, and that I am not going to be a weight on this ranch. I'm going to be an asset, or I'm not going to be here at all. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He said, already. You've been here 11 hours, and you've already found something I missed for 18 months. She picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, put it back down. We should make a fresh pot, she said. This is going to take a while, Amelia. She looked up. He was looking at her with that same directness that had disarmed her in the square, that refusal to look away from whatever he found when he looked at her. He said, not for the bookkeeping, not for the fence line, for something larger and less specific. She looked at him for exactly long enough that it meant something. Thank me yet, she said. Wait until we fixed it. She stood up to make the coffee. Thomas opened the ledger again, and outside the horse was still calling from the pasture, and the ordinary machinery of a shared life began not with any announcement, not with any ceremony, but with the simple fact of two people sitting at the same table, working on the same problem. Is how most real things begin. The first week passed in the way that first weeks do when both parties are paying close attention in a series of small calibrations. Who moved around, whom in the kitchen, who needed quiet in the morning and who needed noise. Could be said directly, and what required a longer approach. Thomas was a man of specific silences. Each one had a different quality. If you listened closely enough, Amelia began to listen. There was the silence of concentration, which was simply absence of words and contained no particular weight. There was the silence of exhaustion, which was heavier and settled on him in the evenings after the physical work was done, when he'd sit at the table with a cup of something and just exist for a while. And there was the third silence, the one she'd noticed first, and it came when something reminded him of Sarah, tea mug in a particular spot, a sound outside, a phrase that landed wrong. She learned not to interrupt that one. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she understood it. She had her own version, smaller and differently shaped, that came when something reminded her of standing alone in a crowd. Harder to read than he appeared. People who didn't know him thought the plainness was simple. What you saw was what you got, man with blunt edges. But Amelia, who had spent her life reading people quickly out of necessity, the architecture underneath. Thomas was not simple. He was disciplined. Those were different things. The simplicity was a structure he'd built over something much more complex, and it required constant maintenance. And once in a while, in the early mornings, before the day's work claimed his full attention, or in the evenings, when the exhaustion wore the structure, thin, something else showed through. One evening, 9 days in, she came into the kitchen and found him sitting at the table with a photograph in his hands. Her come in and put it away so quickly that she almost missed it. Almost. She poured herself water from the tap and said, turning around, "You don't have to put it away." Silence. "I've seen photographs before," she said. "I'm not fragile. I didn't say you were. You put it away so fast you nearly knocked your coffee over." She turned around and leaned against the counter. "That Sarah?" A long pause, then, "Yes." She was pretty, Amelia said, simply because she had caught a half second's worth of the image before it was gone, and it was the honest thing to say. Thomas said nothing. "You don't have to talk about her," Amelia said. "But you don't have to pretend she didn't exist either, because in front of me, she was real. This was her house. I can see that everywhere." She paused. "I'd rather live alongside that than have you exhausting yourself hiding it." He looked at her from across the kitchen. Something moved in his face. "Most people," he said slowly, "I think that if I talk about her, it means I'm stuck." "Most people don't know what grief looks like from the inside," Amelia said. "Not most people." Another silence. Longer, but different in quality from the ones before. This one was open rather than closed, turned towards something rather than away. "She would have liked you," he said. It came out with the careful precision of a man handing over something breakable. Felt the weight of that sentence and held it without flinching. "Me something she did," she said. Not demanded, offered. An open hand, he looked at her. "One thing," she said, "just so I know who I'm sharing the house with." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Amelia thought he was going to retreat into the safe silence. But he didn't. "She used to leave the barn door open on purpose," he said slowly. "To be careless. Because Buck, my quarter horse, he gets anxious when it's fully shut. She figured that out before I did. She never said anything about it. Never made it a project. She just started leaving it open. Buck settled, and I didn't understand why for months until I saw her do it one evening, and he stopped. She just shrugged, like it was obvious. Like, of course, you pay attention to what makes the animals calm." Amelia looked at him. "She sounds like someone who paid attention," she said. "She was," Thomas said. "Better than anyone I ever knew." The room held that for a moment. Amelia said, "The barn door's been closed every night since I got here." Thomas looked at her. "Buck's been a little anxious," she said, not pointedly. Just as an observation. He blinked. And then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, something that cracked open very briefly, almost violently, before he controlled it. His eyes went bright for one moment and then steadied. "I'll leave it open tonight," he said. "All right," she said. Her water glass in the sink and said good night and went down the hall to her room. Salone in the kitchen with the photograph of Sarah in his pocket and the understanding, not comfortable, not easy, but undeniable, that the woman at the end of the hall had just done something that nobody had done for him in 3 years. Her She had made Sarah real in the room without making her a ghost. She had given him permission to remember without making him feel like he was drowning in it. He sat there for a long time after her door closed. Then he got up, went outside in the dark, and left the barn door open. Made a low, satisfied sound from inside. Thomas stood there in the cold for a moment, listening, and felt something he could not immediately name, something that was not happiness and not peace, but was perhaps the earliest precious ancestor of both the sense that the shape of a day could possibly mean more than just the getting through it. He went back inside. He did not put the photograph away. He left it on the kitchen table, face up, and went to bed. And in the morning, when Amelia came in at 4:30 and saw it there, she looked at it for one moment and then put the coffee on and said nothing at all. And that was exactly right. 2 days later, the trouble arrived at the front door. The shape of a man named Dale Hargrove, who ran the feed supplier account and who had clearly been told by someone that the new woman at the Walker Ranch had been asking questions about invoices. Up in a truck that cost more than it should for a feed supplier, with a smile that had been manufactured for exactly this kind of situation, and he asked to speak to Thomas. Thomas brought him into the kitchen. Amelia was at the table with the ledger. She did not stand up. She did not pretend to be doing something else. Hargrove saw her and the smile modified itself. "I heard you had company," he said to Thomas. Didn't realize she was. He gestured vaguely at the paperwork. "Involved." "She's involved," Thomas said. Hargrove looked at Amelia directly for the first time. Looked back. "Miss Hart," she said, "Miss Hart. I wanted to come by personally to clear up any confusion about the account. I understand there might have been some questions about the billing structure." "Not questions," Amelia said. "They're findings." She opened the ledger to the page sheet had marked for 2 days. 18 months of duplicate invoicing. 2 accounts and delivery, both paid. I've got every invoice cross-referenced with delivery record errors. She slid the page toward him. Total comes to $4,240. Hargrove looked at the page. His face went through several things very quickly. There have been an administrative error. "There may have," Amelia said pleasantly. "Administrative errors happen. The correction for an administrative error is a refund and an adjusted billing going forward." She paused. "That's the simple version. The other version involves a formal dispute and a review of your supplier license with the County Agricultural Board. I'm told they take double billing cases seriously." The room was very quiet. Thomas was standing slightly behind her and to the left, and she could feel without looking that he was doing that containing something thing again. But this time, the something was different. This time it was not anger. It was something she didn't have a precise word for, but which felt quality of the air like a man watching something he'd written off as gone suddenly turn out to still be possible. Hargrove looked from Amelia to Thomas and back. "I'll issue a correction," he said. Others had dropped the performance. "Today," Amelia said. "Need a few days to process." "Today," she said again. A tone, the same steadiness. "You can write a check at the table if you'd like." "Of stamps." Another silence. Hargrove reached into his jacket. Thomas behind her made the very quietest sound, barely a sound at all, like the memory of one. And Amelia did not turn around, but she noted it, held it, understood it. He was not a man who made sounds when he was surprised, which meant what she had just heard was something other than surprise. Hargrove wrote the check. He left. The truck reversed out of the drive faster than it had arrived. Miss Walker stood in his own kitchen, holding a check for $4,240 that he had not known he was owed, and looked at the woman sitting at his table who had been in his house for 11 days. "Amelia," he said. She closed the ledger. "We should talk about the other supplier irregularities." "2 more." "Amelia," he said again. She looked up. "I don't know what I was doing before you got here," he said. "No, not a romantic statement. It was something more startling than romance. It was genuine. Confused, almost helpless honesty from a man who was not accustomed to being helped." I looked at him for a moment. "You were surviving," she said. "That's what you were doing. It's not nothing." She paused. "Well, surviving and living are 2 different things. Then I think we can probably do better than surviving." So Thomas stood there with the check in his hand and looked at her, and I did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say, and because she was right, as the woman nobody wanted was sitting at his table and turning his broken ranch into something that might possibly be saved. And he had the strange, vertiginous sense of a man who has been falling for a long time and has just discovered that the ground is closer than he thought and softer, and that landing might not kill him after all. He put the check on the table. He sat down across from her. "Let me the other two," he said. She opened the ledger, and they went to work. The check from Hargrove cleared on a Thursday, and by Friday morning, all of Willow Creek knew about it. Here's the thing about small towns. The money itself was almost secondary to the story of how it was gotten. And the story of how it was gotten spread the way all good stories spread in places where people had known each other too long and were too bored with the familiar version of events. It moved from the hardware store to the diner to the post office with the speed and slight distortion of a rumor. And by the time it reached the far end of Main Street, there were a few details it hadn't started with. None of it remained intact. The new woman at the Walker Ranch had sat down with Dale Hargrove and walked out with a check that Thomas Walker didn't even know he was owed. Caldwell heard it before lunch. Thomas knew he would. He had been expecting the reaction all week, had felt it coming the way you feel a weather shift before the clouds arrive. Particular pressure in the air that had nothing to do with the sky. He had said nothing about it to Amelia because he was still figuring out how to talk about Caldwell without it sounding like a warning, and he did not want to give her warnings. She hadn't asked for them. She had asked for honesty, and honesty about Richard Caldwell required a precision he was still assembling. He didn't have to wait long. Caldwell showed up Saturday morning alone, which was notable. Caldwell almost always traveled with at least one person, whose function was to make him look more significant by association, a ranch hand or somebody. Alone meant this was not a performance. Alone meant this was a conversation he wanted kept small. Thomas heard the truck and went to the door before the knock came. Caldwell stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and an expression that was working very hard to look like friendliness. "Thomas, got a minute?" "I've got a few," Thomas said. He did not step back from the doorway. He did not invite him in. Caldwell noted this. His jaw moved slightly. "Heard about the Hargrove situation," he said. "Had to come by personally. Make sure there were no misunderstandings." "What kind of misunderstandings?" Thomas said. "Where a new arrangement." Caldwell glanced past Thomas's shoulder. "Very briefly, changes the way business gets done around here. Hargrove's been your supplier for 2 years. Good relationship. I'd hate to see something get complicated over a billing error." "It wasn't an error," Thomas said. Caldwell looked at him. "Excuse me?" 18 months. $4,000. "That's not an error, Richard. Error is a wrong number on one invoice. What Hargrove did was a system." Thomas kept his voice level. "I think you know that." Something shifted in Caldwell's face. The friendliness effort stopped. Underneath it was something older and less managed. "Thomas, we've known each other a long time, we have. I've made you a fair offer on this land 3 times. You have. And I've been patient. Patience isn't infinite. And a man running a ranch with," he paused, choosing his next word, "with the care of a man placing a blade, implications, financial and otherwise, would do well to think about his options while he still has them." The air on the porch went very still. Thomas said, "Are you threatening me, Richard?" "I'm advising you," Caldwell said. "To man, the way I would advise any neighbor." "Then I'll advise you back," Thomas said. "To man, get off my porch." Caldwell held his gaze for a long moment. He put his hat back on, with the deliberateness of a man who wants you to know he is not rattled even when he is. "About it," he said. "The offer's still open." He turned and walked back to his truck. There Thomas stood in the doorway until the truck reached the road. Then he turned around and found Amelia standing 6 feet behind him, arms crossed, having clearly been there for most of the conversation. "How long were you standing there?" he said. "Long enough," she said. "He's escalating, yes. That wasn't just a warning. As a test, he wanted to see how you'd respond, whether the Hargrove money shook you or steadied you." She paused. "And you didn't flinch." "I had reasons not to." looked at him. Thing in her expression moved too fast to catalog. It moved. He's going to come back harder, she said. I know. Do you have a lawyer? Thomas was quiet for a moment. One. Moved away after Sarah died. His firm was in Billings and I let the relationship lapse. We need one, she said. There's soon, before Caldwell decides that conversation gave him what he needed. She turned back toward the kitchen table, where the ledger was already open. I found something else this morning. Thomas followed her. There's something else, the East pasture, the grazing rights registration. She pointed to a document she'd pulled from the filing box he'd given her access to 3 days ago. Your registration lapsed 6 months ago. Did you know that? He stared at the document. Oh, it wasn't in the renewal reminders because the renewal reminder was being sent to an old address. Oh, box. The one you stopped using after Sarah died. She paused. Someone switched the mailing address on the registration 2 years ago. At the same time, Hargrove set up the double billing. Thomas sat down slowly. If the East pasture grazing rights aren't registered, he said, Caldwell's, and the sentence didn't need finishing. Caldwell can file a claim on the grazing access, Amelia said. On the land itself, he can't take the land. But without the grazing rights, you lose the East pasture income, which means you lose the margin, Thomas said. Part of it, yes. The kitchen was very quiet. He's been building this for 2 years, Thomas said, and his voice had gone flat in a specific way that was not the grief flat or the habitual flat. This was the flat of a man who has just the full shape of something that has been happening to him while he was looking the other way. There too, Amelia said. Maybe longer. He set up the billing scheme with Hargrove. He diverted the registration notices, filling the fence posts, each thing on its own looks like bad luck or poor management. All of them together is a plan. She met his eyes. He's been waiting for you to run out of road. Thomas was very still. If you'd sold last year, he started. You would never have known how it happened, Amelia said. You would have thought you just couldn't manage it on your own. Something crossed his face that she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, something colder and more measured. The face of a man who has moved past the hot feeling into something that requires more patience and more precision. He had that kind of discipline underneath everything. Well, she'd seen it in smaller things. Now she saw it clearly. Can the grazing rights registration be reinstated? He said. Yes. You have a 60-day window after lapse before a third party can file a claim. Well, 3 weeks left. She paused. We need to file Monday. Then we file Monday. And we need that lawyer, she said. Billings today. She nodded. Then she looked at him, studied him. Briefly and directly, the way she had started doing when she needed to take his temperature. Right? He looked back at her. No, he said. And without drama, but I will be. She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said, you will. It was not a comfort offered. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a woman who did not make statements she hadn't verified. Thomas heard the difference and felt it land somewhere below the level of thought. He picked up his phone and called Billings. The lawyer's name was Carol Sutherland, not the man who'd moved away, but his former colleague, and she drove out from Billings on Tuesday in a sedan that was not built for Montana roads, and which she drove with a complete disregard for that fact. She was 60, compact, precise, and had the particular energy of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that she has stopped bothering to correct it in advance and simply demonstrates afterward. She sat at the kitchen table with Amelia's documentation spread in front of her and said nothing for 11 minutes. Thomas counted. Then she said, "This is clean work." "Thank you," Amelia said. "Where did you train?" "I didn't. Feed store accounts and a lot of attention." Sutherland looked at her over her reading glasses with an expression that was not quite a smile but was the shape of one. "Of attention," she repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "Thomas, you have a case. Not just a defense and offense. Double billing is fraud. The registration diversion is potentially tortious interference. This damage." She glanced at Amelia. "You have documentation, photographs, and measurements," Amelia said. "The day after we fixed the first section. There's dated and timestamped." "You had no legal training," Sutherland said. "There's No. And you started documenting the fence damage because it was going to happen again, Amelia said. And when it happened again, I wanted to have the proof of a pattern. Sutherland set her pen down very carefully. Walker, she said, I want to be professionally objective here. I'll simply say that you have an unusually capable partner in this situation and leave the personal observation at that. Thomas looked at Amelia. Amelia was looking at the documentation. Can we win? Thomas said. Fine winning, Sutherland said. In the immediate term, yes. We can file for the grazing rights reinstatement. We can pursue the fraud claim against Hargrove, and we can build a civil case for the fence interference. That's the legal version. She paused. The practical version is that Caldwell has money and patience and he'll fight all of it. Could be long. How long? Amelia said, a year. Minimum. Could be 2. Thomas was quiet. But here's the thing about men like Richard Caldwell, Sutherland said. Her voice shifted slightly. Something underneath it now. I'm from experience rather than law school. They build schemes carefully because they're counting on the other party to either not notice or not have the resources to fight. When they discover they've been noticed and the other party fighting, they tend to make mistakes. Patience built on assumed victory is very different from patience built on genuine strength. She looked at both of them in turn. Let him react, she said. File Monday. File everything at once. Let him find out the way Caldwell types always find out through the county clerk's office when his assistant calls to check on the grazing registration and discovers it's been renewed and that there's an attached fraud complaint with his hire's name on it. Amelia and Thomas looked at each other. I'll get his attention, Thomas said. It'll do more than that, Sutherland said. Him, the game changed and he wasn't told. She began gathering the documents. Have the filings ready by Sunday night. She left the way she'd arrived without ceremony. There's sedan bouncing back down the gravel road toward the highway with apparent indifference to the terrain. I stood on the porch and watched her go. Behind him, Thea said, she's something. Yes, he said. She's right about making him react. I know. A pause. Something in her voice made him turn. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, defensively, but in the way she stood when she was thinking something through out loud. Caldwell finds out Monday, and he'll find out Monday he's not going to come back to this porch with his hat in his hand. He's going to come back differently. I know that too. I want you to be ready for what that looks like. What do you think it looks like? She was quiet for a moment. I think he goes after the thing he thinks is new and uncertain. The thing he thinks he can pull apart. She paused. Or I think he goes after us. What we are to each other. To convince the town that this, she gestured, the same gesture she'd used in the square, between them, unstable, that you were desperate when you chose me. Whatever I've done here is some kind of scheme. Thomas looked at her steadily. No, she said, with a flatness that matched his own best moments of it. I know it isn't, he said. I was asking to see what your answer sounded like. She looked at him for a moment. It was strategic of you. I learned fast. Something flickered in her expression that almost smiled. He'd been cataloging without intending to, and that appeared when he said something that got past her guard. Go to people who knew you before, she said, getting to the point. He'll say things. People will repeat them. People in this town already think you lost your mind at the selection. I know what this town thinks, Thomas said. And he looked out at the road where Sutherland's car had gone. I stopped caring what this town thought about 3 years ago. Or I just stopped caring for the wrong reasons. He looked back at her. I've got a better reason. Amelia studied him. Do that, she said quietly. Do what? Make me into the reason you stop being afraid. Her voice was careful. Hold. I can't be that for you. That's too much to put on one person. That put on me before been told I was someone's whole reason. And when I turned out to be a regular human being who had hard days and made mistakes, a reason collapsed and they blamed me for it. She held his gaze. I can be your partner. I can be someone worth standing beside. I can't be the whole thing. The directness of it hit him like cold water, and he breathed through it and recognized that it was exactly the right thing to say, and that it had been said with a courage that most people would not have had. That's fair, he said. I know it's fair, she said. Apology. I also know it's hard to hear. It is, he admitted. Sure. But you're right. She uncrossed her arms. Something loosened in her posture, the bracing quality that came when she was saying something she expected to be argued with. Not going anywhere, she said, quieter now. I just need you to know that I'm staying because I chose to stay, not because you need me to. That's a different thing. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said, it is. The filing happened Monday, as planned. Sutherland was precise and swift, and by 10 o'clock in the morning, the grazing rights were reinstated. A fraud complaint was formally attached, and then a civil interference documentation was entered into the county record. Caldwell's assistant had called the county clerk's office. 2 o'clock, Caldwell knew. Thomas knew Caldwell knew because at 2:15 on the south side, a mild, decent man named Frank Ortega, who had been friends with Thomas since before Sarah, a careful, sympathetic distance since, and who Thomas had not spoken to in months, showed up at the fence line. Frank said, I just got a call from Caldwell. I figured, Thomas said. Working the fence post he was setting because the fence needed doing and because the conversation was going to go where it was going, regardless of whether he gave it his full attention. Saying things, Thomas. What kind of things? Frank was a good man and therefore uncomfortable. Sir, he shifted his weight. He's saying, the woman you brought home, that she's working an angle. That she found out you were in financial trouble and he stopped. I don't believe it. I want you to know I don't believe it. Yes. But he's saying it to enough people that it's going to spread, Thomas said. Thomas set the fence post, tested it, stood up and looked at Frank directly. Frank, I've known you since we were both young enough to be stupid about things. I'm going to tell you straight, and I'm going to ask you to spread this one as fast as Caldwell's version. Frank waited. Amelia Hart found 18 months of double billing in my accounts that Caldwell's supplier was running. A diverted registration notice on my East Pasture grazing rights, something that would have let Caldwell file a claim on my access within 3 weeks. She documented the fence, damaged the damage from Caldwell's side, Frank in a way that a lawyer can use. Thomas paused. If she's working an angle, it's the most roundabout way I've ever seen of someone stealing. Everything she's done has put money back into my account and kept my land in my name. Frank was quiet for a moment. Caldwell's going to fight this, Frank said. Let him. He's got lawyers on retainer. Old ones, expensive ones. So do I now, Thomas said. Or possibly more motivated. Frank looked at him. Then he looked toward the house where visible in the kitchen window, which they both knew she wasn't necessarily standing in front of, but which represented the general direction she existed. He looked and he nodded. She's something else, Frank said. Thomas agreed. Frank nodded again. Once the deep nod of a man who has reached a conclusion and made a decision simultaneously. To people, he said, the ones worth talking to. I'd appreciate that, Thomas said. Frank left, and Thomas went back to the fence post. And somewhere in the middle of the ordinary physical work, he realized that for the first time in 3 years, he was not fighting for survival. He was fighting for something. One was not small. That evening, word came back through Frank that Caldwell had called a meeting at the Willow Creek Grange Hall, an informal thing. He'd said just neighbors talking, but the timing was obvious and the guest list Huck had managed to obtain was telling. The big landowners. The men who did business with Caldwell's network. The people who had the most to lose from Caldwell being shown up and the most to gain from staying on his right side. Thomas read the list and felt the old familiar tightening the weight of a fight that was larger than him, that had more resources on the other side than his. He heard Amelia come into the room behind him and held the list out without turning. Caldwell's gathering his people, he said. She took the paper. Read it, set it on the table. Half those men have been overcharged by Caldwell's suppliers at some point, she said. They just don't know it yet. Thomas turned around. She looked up at him. Give me access to the county agricultural records. Public ones, I can get them myself. And ask Frank who else on that list has had fence trouble in the last 2 years. He stared at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Caldwell built his scheme on the assumption that people don't talk to each other, she said. That each rancher who got overcharged or had a registration diverted or a fence pulled would assume it was bad luck and deal with it privately and not connect it to anyone else. She held his gaze. What happens when they find out they're not alone? The room was very quiet. To build a case across multiple properties, Thomas said slowly. To look at public records, she said, and ask some questions. Oh, and if the pattern is what I think it is, Caldwell isn't just trying to take your land. He's been doing this across the whole southern county for years. Thomas sat down, because the size of what she was describing required sitting down to think about clearly, and because the woman standing across from him had just shifted the entire shape of the problem from a defensive fight to something much larger, as he was aware with a clarity that had been building for weeks and which now arrived in full, that he was looking at someone remarkable. In the way of a man, discovering a woman was useful to him. In the deeper, more disorient way of a man who has stopped expecting the world to give him anything and has been given something extraordinary and does not quite know how to hold it without breaking it. Amelia, he said. She recognized the tone, the one he used when he was about to say something he'd been working up to. She went still. Thank you, he said. Not for the accounts or the fence or the lawyers. He stopped because the word he needed was not a word he'd used in a long time, and he was uncertain of its accuracy inside his own chest. She watched him. She did not fill the silence for him. She waited, with the patience of a woman who understood that some things need their full time to be said. You're making this feel like something worth saving, he said, finally. The kitchen was very quiet. Amelia looked at him for a moment. Armor that she wore so efficiently, so expertly, armor that had been built post by post and bolt by bolt out of every time she had been passed over and dismissed and classified as less it did not fall. She was too careful for that, too experienced in the cost of things falling too fast. Something behind it shifted. Something old and stubborn and quietly hopeful leaned very slightly toward the light. It is worth saving, she said. Always was. She picked up the public records request form she'd printed 3 days ago when she'd first had this idea, put it across the table to him and said, sign that so I can file it tomorrow. He signed it. She filed it, and 2 days later, when the first results came back and she laid them out across the kitchen table and showed him the pattern property after property, same supplier names, the same registration anomalies, fence line damage along the same borders. Thomas Walker looked at the map she'd drawn of Caldwell's reach across the southern county and understood for the first time the full scale of what had been moving against him. Understood simultaneously that he was no longer facing it alone. Up from the map, Amelia was watching him with that measuring look, reading his temperature, calibrating what he needed. 20 properties, he said. 7 confirmed, she said. Possibly 3 more. And if we get their documentation, then it's not a civil interference case, she said. Her head aren't a fraud, and that's a different kind of legal conversation. Thomas looked at the map for a long moment. He looked at her. Call Sutherland, he said. Amelia was already picking up the phone. Sutherland called back 40 minutes after Amelia reached her. It lasted 2 hours. Thomas sat at the table through most of it, listening to Amelia's side of the conversation, the measured questions, the precise answers, the occasional pause while she wrote something down with the focused efficiency of someone who had been taking careful notes her entire life and had simply never before had a stage large enough for the skill to matter. When she finally set the phone down, her hand was steady, but her eyes were doing something complicated. "I want all 7 property files," Amelia said. "Everything I've documented, plus whatever the other ranchers will give her." She says if the pattern holds across 7 properties, we're not looking at civil action anymore. What are we looking at? Criminal fraud. Higher fraud, potentially, because some of the billing ran through electronic transfer. Amelia looked at the map spread across the table. While may not have known the exact mechanism that he may have set up the supplier relationships and let men like Hargrove execute the details. He knew, Thomas said. Amelia agreed, he knew. But knowing and proving are two different problems. Thomas was quiet. They're ranchers. Do they know yet what we found? Frank talked to two of them. Elder on the North Ridge and Bo Whitfield out by the county line. She paused. Elder said he'd been wondering for 2 years why his margins were off. Whitfield was angrier, said Caldwell had made him a buyout offer last spring that he'd almost taken because he thought the ranch was just failing. Thomas's jaw tightened. I was almost sold. Almost, Amelia said. He didn't. It was close. She looked up. Thomas, Caldwell wasn't just trying to get your land. He was running this across the whole southern district, property by property, squeezing until people sold or gave up. She held his gaze. There. You weren't special. You were just the next one in line. He absorbed that. It would have made it feel smaller, knowing he was one of many, a personal target. It didn't. Somehow it made it larger and colder. The way industrial cruelty is always worse than personal cruelty because it contains so much more indifference. We need to talk to Calder and Witt directly, Thomas said. Sutherland said the same thing. She wants a meeting. The affected ranchers together next week. She'll drive out. In that car? Thomas said. Leah almost smiled. She said the roads build character. Thomas stood up, pushed his chair back, and walked to the window. Not to look at anything in particular, just to move, because the sitting was something this large required occasional movement to stay contained. He's going to know we're building something, Thomas said. The window. He's not stupid. He'll see the public records requests. He'll hear about Sutherland. He already knows, Leah said. Thomas turned. She had her phone in her hand. She tilted it toward him. A text from Frank Ortega's number. Caldwell's lawyer made 3 calls to the county clerk this morning, asking what was filed and by whom. Clerk said she told them it was public record and they could look it up themselves. Thomas read it twice. He's checking the scope, Amelia said. Trying to figure out how much we have. Let him check. Yes. She set the phone down. We need to move fast now. The moment he understands it's not just you, that it's 7 properties he's going to pivot. Well, he's going to start trying to settle with the ones he thinks are weakest. Offer them something small before the case is fully built, to sign something that closes off their participation. Thomas stared at her. He's going to try to dismantle your coalition before it forms, she said. They're the weakest. She didn't hesitate. Whitfield. Almost sold once. He's angry now, but anger is unstable. It burns hot and then it burns out. Caldwell gets to him this week with a check and a handshake and a let's forget all this. Whitfield might take it. She paused. We need to get to Whitfield first today, Thomas said. Today, she said. Thomas got his jacket. Whitfield was a man in his late 50s who carried the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing a losing situation for so long that the exhaustion had become structural, built into the way he stood, the way he answered questions, the way his eyes moved from face to face with a searching quality, looking for the next disappointment so he could prepare for it. In the door and looked at Thomas, then at Amelia, her bristles, and his expression went through several things quickly. About what you found, he said to Thomas. Frank told me. He paused. It was her that found it. He looked at Amelia, not the way the crowd at the selection had looked at her, with dismissal or the particular blindness of people who see one thing and stop looking. He looked at her the way a man looks at an unexpected rope when he's been drowning. There? Can we come in? Amelia said. He stepped back from the door. At Whitfield's kitchen table, which had the same quality as Thomas's had before. Amelia arrived at the table of a man eating alone, functional and without much in the way of comfort. Whitfield made coffee with the automatic movements of someone who does it out of habit rather than hospitality. And he set the cups down and sat across from them and said, "Tell me what you have," Amelia told him. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, without drama, with specificity. The billing scheme, the registration diversion, the fence interference, the 7 properties, the pattern. Whitfield listened without interrupting. When she finished, quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough to have weight. Then he said, "The offer he made me last spring, yes?" Amelia said, "The orders." He said, "My grazing rights were worth less than I thought." Routed. Said there was a registration issue. I didn't know what he meant. Well, I didn't look into it. He stopped. His hands wrapped around his coffee mug. And he'd already diverted my registration notice. And we believe so, Amelia said. We're pulling your county records as part of the broader request. So he created the problem and then told me about it, so I'd think I had to sell. Whitfield's voice was very flat. He made me think my own ranch was worth less than it was. Purpose, so I'd take less money. Yes, Amelia said. She did not soften it. It did not need softening. Whitfield set his coffee down with a precise, careful movement, the movement of a man exerting significant self-control. What do you need from me? He said. Your invoice records for the last 3 years, Amelia said. Your registration documents, any correspondence with Caldwell or his representatives, and your word that if he contacts you before the case is built, plus before you respond to him. Whitfield looked at her for a moment. I think he'll come to me. I think you're the one he'll try for first, she said, honestly, because he knows you were close before. He thinks another offer better than the last one would be enough. She held his gaze. Is it? Whitfield looked at her steadily, and at Thomas, then back at her. No, he said. Not anymore. He got up and went to get his files. Amelia looked at Thomas across the table. Thomas looked back at her, and the thing he'd been carrying around his chest for 4 weeks, the unnamed thing that he'd been identifying in fragments and pieces and refusing to examine as a whole, pressed against him from the inside with enough force that he had to look away. He looked at his coffee cup. He was in love with her. He had known it in the way you know things you're not ready to deal with, distantly, peripherally, through the evidence of how you moved differently and thought differently and woke up in the morning with something other than dread. Feeling it peripherally and looking at it directly were different things. And he was looking at it now across Whitfield's kitchen table, the clearest and most frightening thing he had felt in 3 years. He was in love with Amelia Hart, who had told him precisely, and with the full force of her intelligence, not to make her the reason for things, who had said, be the whole thing. He looked back up. She was watching him with that calibrating expression. Right, she said. Fine, he said, thinking. She let him think. Whitfield came back with a box of files that he set on the table for the next 2 hours, and the whole time Thomas was thinking 2 separate things. Simultaneously, the case required full attention, and the other thing, a kind of courage he was not sure he had rebuilt yet. The meeting at the Walker Ranch happened the following Thursday. Evelyn drove out in her invincible sedan. Frank Ortega came. Elder came, a quiet man who shook Amelia's hand with the formality of someone who had decided to trust her and was marking the decision formally. Whitfield came and brought his brother-in-law, a small operation 2 miles east. 3 other ranchers who Frank had talked to, who had made their own investigations and found their own irregularities, came and sat in Thomas's living room, which had not held that many people since Sarah's funeral. Amelia stood at the end of the room, with Sutherland's documentation spread on the table, and walked 7 ranchers through what she had found, property by property, irregularity by irregularity, amount by amount. She did it the way she did everything without performance, asking anyone to feel anything, just laying the facts down in order and letting the facts do what facts do. The room got very quiet as she talked. Halfway through, her said, "How long have you been an accountant?" "I'm not," Amelia said. Flemish rancher's wife who grew up on a farm and kept the books at a feed store. Calder looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked back at his own invoice documents. Amelia had cross-referenced with the county records and marked in 3 colors. "Right," he said, in the tone of a man who has reclassified something significant. Sutherland took over, for the second half, the legal mechanics, strategy, the timeline. She was direct and unsparing about the difficulty. Going to take time. Would fight. Be months of counter-filings and depositions and the particular grinding patience that legal fights required. The pattern was clear enough and documented well enough that she believed, not guaranteed, believed that the case was winnable. "And if we win," Whitfield said, Compensatory damages for each property based on documented losses, Sutherland said. That determination means potential punitive damages on top of that. While supplier network gets audited, his ability to operate in this county on the terms he's been operating on that ends. The room was quiet again. Ortega said, "I'm in." It went around the room, each man in turn, some with more words and some with fewer, all of them landing in the same place. When the last one had spoken, Helen closed her folder and said, "I'll file the consolidated complaint by end of next week." The ranchers left in ones and twos, quieted by degrees, and eventually it was just Thomas and Amelia, and the remains of a lot of coffee in Sutherland, who was putting on her coat with the purposeful efficiency of a woman, with 4 more hours of driving ahead of her. Sutherland paused and looked at Thomas. "You have good people in your corner," she said. "I know," Thomas said. Looked at Amelia, and she started, and then appeared to reconsider the full sentence. "What you built here, her scratch, 4 weeks, legal training and no institutional support." She stopped again. And then she said simply, "Don't stop." She went out to her car. Miss Amelia stood in the quiet of the emptied house. "She meant the accounting," Amelia said after a moment. "All of it," Thomas said. Amelia looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct, full, undeflected look that he'd aimed at her in the square, that had started everything, but it was different now. Then it had been recognition. Now it was something that had grown from recognition into something larger and less containable. At land. She could not pretend she didn't. She started. "I know what you told me," he said. She could build the sentence. "In the kitchen that evening, not being the whole reason. I heard it. I understood it. Not going back on understanding it." She waited. "I need to tell you something true," he said, "because I've been carrying it around for 3 weeks, and I am not good at carrying things I can't name. I don't name it, I'm going to spend the next however long finding other reasons to stand in the same room as you." He paused. "Love you. That's the truth. That's what I've been trying to arrange into something more manageable, and that's failing." The room held that for a moment. Amelia looked at him. The armor was doing its job. She could feel it doing its job, activating the way it always did when something large came toward her. Impulse to evaluate before feeling, to examine the thing from a safe distance before allowing it to make contact. "Heard you," she said. "I know. I need a minute." "Take it," he said, and meant it, and sat down on the arm of the chair by the window, which was his way of saying, "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not requiring anything from you right now." She stood in the middle of the room and had her minute. She gave it to herself, fully felt the fear, which was real and earned, and which named itself in specific terms. First man who had chosen her out of pity. The second man who had chosen her out of the need to feel generous. Cost of those choices, measured in months of trying to be enough, of shrinking and adjusting, and finally understanding that she could not make herself into the thing someone else needed her to be. Then she felt the other thing that had been growing since the morning she'd found the double billing, and he'd looked at her across the kitchen table like a man being given water after a very long walk. The thing that had been growing since the barn door, photograph of Sarah, left face up on the table. Since some things aren't about strategy, since every morning at 4:30, since kitchen, fence line, her ledger, Whitfield's table, this room full of ranchers who were here because she had built something worth coming to. The other thing was not small. She looked at Thomas, who was sitting on the arm of the chair and looking back at her with the patience of a man who has learned, through the worst possible teacher, that the only things worth having are the things worth waiting for. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Before I say anything else, say it. I am not a simple person. I am not easy. I have a temper when I'm pushed past a certain point, and I hold opinions very strongly, and I will argue with you about things that matter to me, and I will not back down just to keep the peace." She held his gaze. "I've been alone most of my life in ways that have nothing to do with other people being around. That has made me self-sufficient in ways that can feel like the walls to someone trying to get close." She paused. "I'm telling you this so that you know what you are saying when you say what you just said. I know what I'm saying, Thomas said. He said it simply, without defense. Do you? You have a temper, he said. Opinions. You argue without backing down. He paused. Amelia, I watched you face down Dale Hargrove with an invoice ledger and no legal training. Watched you identify a county-wide fraud scheme from a broken fence post. Watched you sit in a room full of men twice your age who'd been ranching all their lives and explain their own situation to them so clearly that none of them could argue with a single word. He looked at her steadily. Want simple. I've been living with simple for 3 years, and it almost killed me. Simple that has nothing in it. Her breath came out slightly unsteady. She steadied it. And Sarah, she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Always be the first part of my life, he said. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. I'm not going to pretend she occupies less space than she does. Others. But you said something to me early on. You said I didn't have to hide her. You'd rather live alongside it than have me exhausting myself hiding it. He paused. You were right then, and I'm asking you to hold to that. What I feel for you is not a replacement, and it is not a forgetting. It's a continuation of the part of me that can still want things. Thought was gone. Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Armor did not fall. She was too honest with herself to pretend it had, and that one speech, however true and however carefully offered, told 3 years of construction in 5 minutes. Real things didn't work that way, but a door in it opened. Hi, she said. And for the 4th time, those 2 words carried everything. Crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he took her hand, the left one, the one with the scar along the forearm, and held it in both of his, not making anything out of it, not performing the gesture, just holding it with the same plainness he brought to everything. She let him. They stood there for a moment in the quiet house. You have 5 ranchers' documents to process, she said. Yes, he agreed. And Sutherland needs the consolidated file by Friday. I know, so we should probably, he said. What? Give yourself 30 seconds, he said. Just 30 seconds where you're not already thinking about what's next. She looked at him. There's fun for the first time since she had come to this house and this land and this life that had arrived so suddenly and so unexpectedly and so unlike anything she had planned for. She stopped moving and calculating and managing and fortifying. And she stood in the kitchen of the house that had been empty for 3 years, held by a man who had chosen her in front of the whole town without a single strategic reason for doing so. And she let 30 seconds pass without filling them. It's the most frightening and the most necessary thing she had done yet. When the 30 seconds were done, she said, okay, and squeezed his hand once and let go, and went back to the table and opened the files. Thomas watched her for a moment, and the feeling in his chest was so large and so specific that he had to stand still and simply hold it for a second before he could be useful again. Then he sat down across from her. They worked until midnight. Caldwell's response to the consolidated filing arrived 12 days later in the form of a letter from his attorney, 12 pages of legal language that Sutherland translated over the phone into its essential content. Caldwell was denying all allegations, characterizing the billing irregularities as contractor errors that he bore no responsibility for, and filing a counter-complaint alleging that the documentation Amelia had assembled was obtained through improper access to private business records. "I broke in somewhere," Amelia said, when Sutherland explained it. He's saying your access to Thomas's private accounts constitutes a conflict of interest and potential breach of fiduciary responsibility, Sutherland said. I'm his wife. In Caldwell's filing, he describes you as. Sutherland paused. Thomas, who was listening on the other end of the kitchen table, saw something in Amelia's face go very still at the pause. The person who entered this arrangement under circumstances that suggest financial opportunism and whose involvement in the documentation should therefore be subject to scrutiny. The kitchen was very quiet. Amelia said, "He's going after my credibility." Yes, Sutherland said, trying to reframe you as the problem. Not just your findings, you personally. There's your marriage, your background, your presence at the selection day, the speed with which you became involved in Thomas's financial affairs. A pause. It's a predictable strategy. It's also not without risk for him, as discrediting you requires him to make claims he'll need to support. What do we do? Thomas said. His voice was very controlled. We respond to the filing formally, I'll handle. And then we do nothing, Sutherland said. We let him say what he's going to say. Because every claim he makes publicly, we have to support evidentially. And right now, evidence is opinion, ours is documentation. And in the meantime, Amelia said, Sutherland said, he's going to say things in this town. You, Amelia, about your motives, your history, or your character. Some people will believe him because he's been here longer and has more social infrastructure. I want you to be prepared for that. Amelia was already prepared for that. She had been prepared for that version of the world since she was 9 years old and learned that a visible difference was enough to make people decide they knew everything about you. Prepared, she said, but Thomas was not. He discovered this over the following week in the particular way that you discover the depth of a feeling by watching what it does when something threatens the thing you feel it for. Remember, he had been to Willow Creek twice that week, once for supplies, because Sutherland needed something notarized at the county office, and both times he had heard things. Or heard things, the specific conversations that stop when you come close enough to catch the last sentence. Particular looks that move from face to face in a room when the door opens and the wrong person walks in. Hardware store, a man he'd known for 15 years, a man named Garrett, that he'd once helped move a tractor out of a ditch at 3 a.m. without being asked, turned away from him at the counter without speaking, but with hostility, with discomfort, the discomfort of a man who has heard something he can't verify and cannot unknow, and does not quite know how to position himself relative to. Thomas bought his supplies and drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for 4 minutes before he went inside. Amelia was at the table. She looked up when he came in and read something in his face immediately. What happened, she said. Nothing specific. Thomas, he sat down. Heard Garrett wouldn't look at me at the hardware store. She was quiet. Well, he knows me for 15 years, Thomas said. He knows me. Caldwell said something, or someone who heard Caldwell said something, and now Garrett can't look at me in the hardware store. I'm sorry, Amelia said. Don't be sorry, he said, and it came out harsher than he meant it, and softened immediately. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at the situation. I know the difference, she said. He looked at her. You've had this your whole life, he said. Deciding who you are from a distance, making up a story about you, and then just believing it instead of looking. Yes, she said. How did you? He started and stopped because the question had too many possible endings and he wasn't sure which one he meant. Did I not collapse under it? She offered. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Angry first, she said. For a long time I was just furious, visibly mostly. But underneath everything, there was this constant anger at having to be twice as precise, twice as careful, twice as prepared as anyone else, just to be taken seriously. She paused. And then the anger became something else. It became fuel, I guess. It became the reason I kept the accounts better than anyone expected. Kept showing up in rooms where I wasn't wanted. Kept going to selection days. She looked at me. I don't know if that's strength or just stubbornness with better branding. It kept you here, he said, in this room, at this table. She looked at him. I am grateful for it every single day, he said. She did not look away. She held his gaze with the particular honesty she brought to the things that mattered. Me too, she said quietly. I am too. The hearing was set for 11 weeks out. Sutherland was building the case with the meticulous patience of someone who understood that the architecture of a legal argument had to be sound before it could hold weight. Twice a week. She drove out twice more, each time in the car, each time apparently finding the roads perfectly acceptable. The ranchers held. Whitfield, true to his word, told Thomas, the morning after Caldwell's representative contacted him with a revised offer better numbers, a handshake, a request that Whitfield consider his future relationship with the community. What did you tell them? Thomas asked. I told them I'd already made my decision about my future relationship with the community, Whitfield said. and I told them where they could put the offer. Thomas told Amelia. Amelia put her face in her hands, for a moment not in despair, but in the particular expression of someone receiving good news that they had been genuinely uncertain about. "Hold," she said from behind her hands. He held. Thomas confirmed. "Put her hands," she said. "Okay." He had learned by now the different qualities of her okay. This one was the one she used when something that had been genuinely precarious had come through, and she needed a moment to recalibrate from bracing to standing straight. He gave her the moment. Life on the ranch had settled into something that was neither the desperate purposefulness of the early weeks nor the grief-saturated routine of the years before Amelia. It had become a life. The kind of life that has texture and disagreement and occasional irritation and the specific comfort of knowing a given morning what the shape of the day will be and who will be in it. Argued the way she had warned him they would. Money, specifically about which legal fees to prioritize when the budget was still thin. South pasture, Thomas thought it needed to rest. Amelia had run the numbers and believed resting it cost more than grazing it moderately. Buck, who had developed a hoof issue that Thomas wanted to treat one way, and Amelia had read about an alternative approach and was not shy about saying so. Last one she won, which Thomas acknowledged with the brief, ungracious silence of a man conceding a point he'd held firmly and which she had the decency not to make anything out of. Laughed too. Not often at first. Laughed was a thing that came back slowly, like feeling returning to a limb that had gone numb. It came back, small things at first, a horse making an improbable sound at an improbable moment, a mistake in the ledger that turned out to be Thomas's own handwriting being illegible in a way that converted a 2 into a 7 and produced an accounting result so bizarre that Amelia had spent 20 minutes trying to figure out how it was possible before she showed it to Thomas, and he looked at it and said, "That's a 2," and she looked at him and said, "That is the worst 2 I have ever seen in my life." And he looked back at her, and something cracked open in both of them simultaneously. Graceful, the way it came back. It was awkward and slightly rusty, and occasionally one of them laughed at something that the other didn't find funny, which produced its own kind of negotiation. But it was real, the realest thing in the house. One evening, 6 weeks after the filing, Thomas came in from the evening work and found Amelia in the kitchen with the old photograph of Sarah on the table in front of her. Daughters, not hidden. She hadn't taken it from somewhere private. He had left it on the shelf in the living room, face out. Since the night he'd left it on the table, she had simply picked it up and was looking at it. She heard him come in and looked up, and there was nothing guilty in her expression, just the straightforwardness of a person doing something she had decided was reasonable. "His kind eyes," Amelia said. Thomas sat down across from her. He looked at the photograph in her hands. "She did," he said. "Of eyes that means someone laughs easily." "She laughed all the time," Thomas said. "For everything. It used to drive me crazy when I was being serious about something, and she'd find the funny thing in it." He paused. "I'd give a lot to be driven crazy by that right now." Amelia looked at him. She said simply, "I don't say it to, I know why you say it," she said. "Because it's true, and I'd rather you say true things than protect me from them." She set the photograph down gently, face up the way he'd started leaving it. "She shaped this house. She shaped you, whatever you are that I came here to. She made a lot of it." She paused. "I'm not in competition with that. Never was." Thomas looked at her across the kitchen table, and the feeling in his chest was so layered and so specific: grief and love and gratitude, something that was still everything, slightly disbelieving that this was real, that she was real, that the house, which had been silent and deadened for 3 years, contained this much living that he couldn't organize it into words. "I want you to know that I see you, not what I needed when I walked across that square. That the town sees, not the contrast to anything or the solution to anything." He held her gaze. Specifically, Amelia looked at him for a long moment, and the door in the armor swung wider, and she let it grow. And it was the bravest thing she had done, yet braver than the confrontation with Hargrove, braver than the room full of ranchers, braver than any of it. because this was the one thing she had no documentation for. Evidence base, no strategy. This was just the unreasonable, entirely human choice to believe that she was being seen correctly. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. I see you too, she said. They sat like that for a while. Outside, Buck made his low, settled sound from the barn with the open door. The house, which had been a place of surviving for 3 years, in that moment, without ceremony, without announcement, a place of living again. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in October, and the night before it, neither of them slept. Thomas knew Amelia wasn't sleeping because he could hear her moving in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the specific quiet sounds of someone who has given up on lying still and has defaulted to usefulness. Up and found her at the table with the consolidated file open in front of her, going through it for what he estimated was the 4th time that week. "Buddy," he said from the doorway. "I know," she said. "Are you reading it again?" She looked up at him. In the low kitchen light, she looked tired, in the way of someone who has been running on precision and discipline for 3 months and is approaching the end of what pure will can sustain. "Because if I sit still, I think about all the ways it could go wrong," she said. "And if I read the file, I'm thinking about the file." He sat down across from her. "The ways it could go wrong." She looked at him. "Didn't help." "Tell me anyway." A pause. Then she set the file down and folded her hands on top of it and said, "Wells' attorney is going to attack my standing. The fact that I have no professional credentials. The fact that the documentation was assembled by someone with a personal stake in the outcome." She paused. "He's going to call me a wife who went through her husband's papers and dressed it up as forensic accounting. And Sutherland will answer that." "Sutherland will answer it well," Amelia said. "A judge is still a person, and a person listening to 2 arguments decides partly on evidence and partly on which version of the story feels true." She looked at the file. "Caldwell has been in this county for 30 years. His relationships, his credibility, built from decades of being the man everyone sees as the authority." She looked up. "I've been here 3 months. Thomas looked at her steadily. "I recovered $4,000 from a fraudulent supplier, reinstated 7 grazing rights registrations, and assembled a case that 7 ranchers have signed their names to." He paused. "That's not nothing, Amelia. That's a record. Records can be characterized," she said. "That's what his attorney is going to do. Take every accurate thing I did and put a frame around it that makes it look like something else. Then we take the frame off," Thomas said. That's what Sutherland is for." She looked at him. "Afraid," she said. "I'm terrified," he said. "I've noticed that being terrified doesn't change what happens tomorrow. It just uses up tonight." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way she had done for him 6 weeks ago across this same table. It was the file. She looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the file. "Come sit outside for a bit," he said. "Old, but it's clear." "Thomas, it's 2 in the morning. I know what time it is." They went outside and sat on the porch steps in the cold Montana night. High above them was the specific clear black of high altitude with no cloud cover. Ours were the kind that city people don't believe exist until they see them. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence between them had long since stopped being uncomfortable. It had become one of the more reliable things in both their lives. Silence that contained rather than excluded. After a while, Leah said, "This is over. When this is over," Thomas agreed, as though finishing the sentence was something they could do together without knowing its end. Looked at the sky. "I want to put a proper garden in. In the spring, not just the section I repaired, the whole east side of the house." Ours corner. He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked that," he said. "No," Amelia said. "That's why I want to do it." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the cold under the enormous sky. And the hearing was 11 hours away, and neither of them talked about it again. Back inside at 3:30 and slept for 4 hours and were up before the alarm. The courthouse in Willow Creek was a building that took itself seriously old enough to have accumulated the institutional gravity of a place where difficult things had been decided, large enough to hold the weight of what it contained. By 8:30 in the morning, It was more full than Thomas had expected. He had expected Sutherland and Caldwell's legal team and the 7 ranchers and whatever administrative personnel the process required. Not expected Frank Ortega was there with his hat in his hands and a firm, quiet nod when Thomas walked in. He had not expected Bo Whitfield, not just himself, but his wife, a steady woman named Lorraine, who shook Amelia's hand with both of hers and held it for a moment without saying anything. Everything. He had not expected Jim Calder or the 3 additional ranchers or Pete Harlow from the hardware store. And this one stopped him. Garrett, the man who hadn't been able to look at him 3 weeks ago at the hardware counter. Garrett was standing near the back. When Thomas came in, his eye and held it, and there was something in his expression that was not quite apology. Garrett was not a man who did apology gracefully, but was the next closest thing. Acknowledgement. A presence that said, I got it wrong, and I'm here to say so in the only language I have. Thomas nodded at him once. Garrett nodded back. They were even. Amelia saw it happen from beside him. She said nothing. Her register it. Caldwell arrived at 8:55 with 2 attorneys and the particular composure of a man who has decided in advance that he is going to win and has organized his presentation around that certainty. He did not look at Amelia when he came in. He looked at Thomas with the expression of a man who considers the whole proceeding an inconvenience he will shortly conclude. Thomas met his eyes and held them until Caldwell looked away first. Sutherland was already at the plaintiff's table, her documents arranged with the precision of someone who views disorder as a form of argument she refuses to make. She looked up when Thomas and Amelia sat down beside her and said, preamble, you both look like you slept. 4 hours, Amelia said. Enough, Sutherland said. I had 3. The judge was a woman named Patricia Howe, 62. Sums from Billings with a record Sutherland had described as exacting and deeply unimpressed by social standing. She came in at 9 o'clock precisely, and the room stood and settled and the proceeding began. Caldwell's attorney went first as the responding party, and he was good. Thomas had expected good. He had not fully accounted for how good. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had the particular skill of a man who could take accurate facts and arrange them into a narrative that felt true even when the arrangement was dishonest. Described the billing irregularities as contractor errors that had since been corrected. He produced Hargrove's corrected invoices as evidence of good faith resolution. He described the grazing registration diversions as administrative anomalies in a county system that he implied was not immune to clerical failure. He described the fence damage as the natural result of cattle pressure on aging infrastructure. And then he described Amelia. He did it carefully. Her names. He didn't make accusations that could be directly refuted. He constructed slowly and with considerable skill of a woman who had arrived in Thomas Walker's life under circumstances that were, at minimum, expedient, who had inserted herself into his financial affairs within days of arrival, who had no professional qualifications for the analysis she claimed to have performed, and whose findings, therefore, should be weighed against the considerable question of her objectivity and her motives. He said the word convenient twice. He said the word arrangement in a way that carried implications he was careful not to state explicitly, as stating them would have required him to support them. Thomas felt Amelia go very still beside him during this portion. He did not look at her. He looked at the judge. Judge Howe's face during Webb's presentation was the face of a woman listening to an argument she is evaluating on its merits rather than its manner. She wrote things down. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them surgical, and both of them directed at the weakest joints in Webb's framing. Thomas liked her immediately. When Sutherland stood up, the room had the particular quality of a space that has been tilted one direction and is waiting to see whether it will be righted. Sutherland did not begin with Amelia. She began with the numbers. Judge Howe, through the documentation with the patient, unsparing precision of someone who has organized an argument to move like a machine, each piece engaging the next, whole structure designed so that removing any single part would require explaining why it was absent. Full billing, the registration diversions, the fence interference, each with its own documentation column, each cross-referenced, each time-stamped. 7 properties. A combined loss of over $38,000 across the ranching community of the southern county accumulated over a minimum of 2 years. The room was very quiet. Sutherland Southern said, "I'd like to address the characterization of art." Directly, Judge Howe said, "Go ahead, Mr. Webb has suggested that the documentation assembled by Ms. should be viewed with skepticism due to her personal stake in the outcome and her lack of professional credentials," Sutherland said. Or what? "I would ask the court to consider an alternative framing. Identified irregularities that professional accountants, reviewers, and county administrators all failed to identify over the same period." She did so within 11 days of arriving at the Walker Ranch. She then extended her analysis voluntarily, without compensation, legal obligation, to 6 additional properties, and produced documentation of sufficient quality that 7 ranchers signed their names to a consolidated complaint, and this court agreed to hear it. She paused. The question of Ms. Hart's credentials is, I would suggest, somewhat answered by her results. Something moved through the room. The sound people were too careful for sound, but a quality change, atmospheric shift of a group of people updating their assessment of something simultaneously. Judge Howe looked at Sutherland. Then she looked at Amelia Hart, she said. "I'd like to ask you a few questions directly. If you're willing," Amelia stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The consolidated documentation. You assembled this personally?" "Yes." "Describe your methodology." And Amelia, who had prepared for this possibility, she prepared for all possibilities, because preparation was the thing that had kept her functional when everything else was unreliable, described her methodology. She described it in plain language, without jargon, with the specific clarity of someone who understands a thing well enough to explain it to anyone. She described the invoice cross-referencing, the county records requests, registration timeline mapping, the fence interference documentation protocol she had set up from the 3rd day. Judge Howe listened without interrupting. She wrote things down. Then she said, "How did you know to look for the registration diversions?" Amelia said, "Because the billing scheme told me someone was paying attention to the administrative details. Anyone who could set up an 18-month double billing without detection was paying attention. And paying that close attention would know that grazing registration is one of the administrative details that ranchers often manage inconsistently." She paused. I looked. A beat of silence. "And the fence interference documentation," Judge Howe said, "began that on the 3rd day?" "Yes, before you had any evidence of deliberate interference." "I had a pulled fence post," Amelia said. "Lower. A fence post doesn't lever itself out of the ground." That was evidence. Judge Howe looked at her for a moment with an expression that was still judicial and still alluative, but which contained, Amelia thought, the very faintest signal of a woman who has heard enough people be called things they weren't. The judge said, "You may sit." Amelia sat. Sutherland remained standing and said, calmly, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Bo Whitfield to the stand." Webb objected on grounds that they hadn't been notified of a witness. Sutherland produced the notification, filed 9 days prior. Webb reviewed it. The objection was withdrawn. Whitfield took the stand with the ungainly purposefulness of a man who is not comfortable being looked at by many people simultaneously, but has decided to endure it because the alternative is worse. He confirmed the offer Caldwell had made him in the spring. Caldwell had specifically mentioned the grazing registration issue. During that offer, the same registration issue that had been caused, documentation showed by a diverted notice that bore the hallmarks of the same diversion pattern found on 6 other properties. Webb cross-examined. He asked Whitfield whether he had any direct evidence of Caldwell's personal involvement in the billing arrangements. Whitfield said no. Webb asked whether he had any direct evidence of deliberate interference with the fence lines. Whitfield said no. Webb sat down, apparently satisfied. Sutherland stood up for redirect. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, Caldwell told you about the grazing registration problem during his offer meeting. Did he tell you how he knew about it?" Whitfield said, "I asked him, and he said he'd heard it through the county office. And had you received any official communication from the county office about a registration problem? No. Had you received any communication at all about a registration problem before Mr. Caldwell mentioned it? No. So Mr. Caldwell was aware of an administrative problem with your grazing registration before you received any official notice of it? Yes, Sutherland said. Room and sat down. Was very quiet. Webb was on his feet immediately with an explanation about the interconnected nature of county land records being accessible to anyone with a registered interest in adjacent property. Sutherland let him talk. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said, only, Your Honor, Caldwell's adjacent property interest in Whitfield's land is documented as originating from the buyout offer, which was made 6 days after the registration notice was diverted. The dates, she held up the document. I'd like to enter this as Exhibit 41. Thomas felt Amelia's hand find his under the table. Hold it. Caldwell's composure, which had been presenting as certainty all morning, began to show its structural limitations around 11 o'clock. It was subtle, the way a building doesn't collapse all at once but shows the stress first in small ways. Back here, a shift there. He spoke twice to Webb in urgent whispers. At the documentation, Sutherland entered with an expression that was moving from dismissal towards something that contained more effort. 7:15, Webb asked for a recess. Judge Howe granted 15 minutes. Away, Sutherland pulled Thomas and Amelia aside and said, quietly and with no expression in her voice, he's going to offer a settlement in the next hour. How do you know? Thomas said. I've seen that recess request before, she said. Client is recalculating. A settlement lets him control the terms. If we go to judgment, he loses control entirely. She looked at Amelia. The question is what you want. What do we get in a settlement versus a judgment? Amelia said. Settlement, he sets the number. It'll be significant. He'll want this to go away cleanly, but he controls it. Most certainly include a non-disclosure clause. And a judgment? Judgment, the court sets the damages. Could be lower. No NDA. Everything stays public record. Sutherland paused. A judgment on the fraud count means a referral to the county attorney for criminal review. Thomas and Amelia looked at each other. They're ranchers, Amelia said. If we settle with NDA, what happens to their ability to pursue their individual claims? Sutherland said, carefully, a consolidated settlement would be structured to include all parties. A non-disclosure would limit their ability to use this proceeding as the basis for any further action. So, Caldwell walks away quiet, Thomas said. Tentatively, Thomas looked at Amelia. She was already looking at him. A judgment, she said. He nodded, once. You understand that judgment takes longer, Sutherland said. And the risk is, we go to judgment, Thomas said. Sutherland looked at both of them for a moment, and the thing that was almost, but not quite, a smile appeared. Right, she said. They went back in. Webb made the settlement approach at 11:43 formally, framed as a gesture of good faith. Sutherland declined on behalf of the plaintiffs. Webb's face did something it hadn't done all morning. Caldwell's face did something considerably more significant. Judge Howe said, we'll proceed to closing statements. Sutherland's closing took 18 minutes. It was the most efficient piece of spoken argument Thomas had ever heard, every sentence doing work. Nothing decorative. The whole thing moving like a river that knows exactly where it's going. Throughout, she summarized the pattern, identified the harm, named each affected property, and then she said something that Thomas had not expected and which hit the room differently from everything else. She said, the defense has spent considerable time this morning questioning the credibility of Amelia Hart. I want to address that directly because I think it's important. Hart came to Willow Creek with no credentials, institutional backing, no social history in this community, and as has been referenced repeatedly, circumstances of arrival that were characterized as unconventional. She paused. In 3 months, she identified and documented a fraud scheme that had operated undetected for a minimum of 2 years, recovered money that multiple experienced ranchers had simply written off as bad luck. She built a case that 7 property owners trusted enough to put their names to, and that this court agreed was substantial enough to hear. She looked at Judge Howe. This question of Miss Hart's credibility has been answered on her by every outcome. The room was quiet. Webb's closing was technically competent and politically dead. He made his arguments. They landed in silence. Judge Howe recessed for deliberation at 12:41. They waited in the hallway. Thomas and Amelia on a wooden bench, Sutherland standing with her phone, Frank Ortega, and the other ranchers occupying the space around them in the particular configuration of people who are holding something together by proximity. Whitfield sat next to Amelia and said nothing, which was exactly right. Then Whitfield had brought a thermos of coffee and poured cups for everyone without being asked. At 1:58, Judge Howe came back. She found for the plaintiffs on all primary counts, documented and confirmed, tortious interference with business relations, 7 properties. The damages figure she named was $44,000 in compensatory relief higher than the documented losses, for compounding costs and the disruption of operations. She referred the matter to the county attorney for criminal review of the fraud counts. She did not include a non-disclosure requirement. Everything was public record. The hallway outside the courtroom afterward was the loudest Thomas had heard any space in Willow Creek since the Friday nights at Denny's Saloon that he barely remembered anymore. Ortega shook his hand hard enough to require some recovery. Whitfield said nothing intelligible, but the grip he put on Thomas's shoulder communicated everything. Who had said approximately 12 words throughout the entire process, said to Amelia, "You ever need a reference for anything at all, you call me," and walked away before she could respond. Sutherland accepted congratulations with the brisk efficiency of a woman who considers celebration a fine thing as long as it doesn't last longer than necessary. Plus, she told Thomas the damages check would take 30 days. A criminal referral process would move on its own timeline, and she'd send her final invoice by the end of the week. Then she got her coat, shook both their hands, said, "Don't let the driveway beat that suspension into complete submission before my next visit," and walked out to her car. Thomas watched her go. Then he turned around and found Amelia standing in the middle of the courthouse hallway. And for a moment, neither of them moved because the thing they had been carrying for 11 weeks had just been set down, and the sudden absence of its weight was its own kind of disorientation. She looked at him. He crossed the hall and put his arms around her, and she let him do. And she let him fully, without the measured quality of someone how much contact to allow. She leaned into it the way people lean into things they've needed for longer than they've admitted. Let her breathe. "It's done," she said into his shoulder. "Done," he confirmed. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were bright in the way of someone who has not cried and is not going to, but whose body has noted the emotional significance of the moment and is registering it through available channels. She said. He blinked. "What?" "I want to start planting the garden. Before the ground gets too hard." She paused. "I've been thinking about what to plant in Sarah's corner. I'd like to talk to you about it." Thomas looked at her, this woman who, in the same breath as the resolution of a 3-month legal battle, they're already thinking about what to put in the ground next spring, already moving toward the next thing, the growing thing, the thing that would require patience and attention and the willingness to tend something over time without immediate results. "This weekend," he said. "Saturday morning," she said. "After the horses." "After the horses," he agreed. She took his hand, and they walked out of the courthouse together. Behind them, the door closed on everything Caldwell had built. One of them, the October light, was the particular amber gold of a Montana afternoon that knows the cold is coming and offers everything it has before it does. Caldwell did not appear at the county criminal hearing 3 months later. His attorney appeared on his behalf and entered a no-contest plea on the fraud counts, pledged a significant fine, a mandatory restitution payment to each affected rancher, 5-year bar from entering into supplier or land agreements in the county without prior administrative review. Everything. It was not prison, but it was, Sutherland said, when she called with the news, the end of his operational model in this part of Montana. run the scheme anymore. She said, the mechanism is broken. But every transaction he makes in this county for the next 5 years gets reviewed. For a man who operated on opacity, that's the real punishment. Thomas told Amelia that evening. She set down what she was doing and was quiet for a moment. She said, just that. He looked at her. Not what you hoped. She thought about it honestly. Wanted more for the ranchers, she said. I wanted Whitfield to get back every dollar he almost sold his ranch for. I wanted every man on that list to feel like the full weight of it was acknowledged. She paused. I also know that the world doesn't always give you everything. And what we actually got is real, and it's documented, and it's permanent. She met his eyes. It's done. The thing he was doing is done. The land stays with the people it belongs to. Yes, Thomas said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has made peace with the gap between what is just and what is possible, and who has not confused the two, but has refused to let the gap make her stop moving. The damages check came today, Thomas added. She looked up, heard the legal fees, and the east pasture fencing, and the spring feed order, he said. Enough left to make the east side of the house livable and to put the garden in properly. Amelia looked at him. He said carefully that we might talk about what else we want to build. Garden. The kitchen was quiet. What do you mean, she said. But she knew what he meant, and he knew she knew. And the question was just the form that the moment required. I mean that we've been living like two people who are managing a situation, he said. And I don't want to manage a situation anymore. I want to build a life. With your name on the deed next to mine, your opinion in every decision, and your temper when I'm wrong about things, and your laugh when something is actually funny. He paused. I mean that I want to stop being careful about asking you if this is permanent. She looked at him across the table. Permanent, she said. Is that an answer? Yes, she said. That's an answer. This is permanent. I decided that a long time ago, and I've been waiting for you to stop being afraid to say it out loud. He blinked. Week 3, she said. When you left the photograph of Sarah face up on the table. I knew then. Week 3, he repeated. You were very slow, she said. And the thing in her expression that had been the almost smile for months, the one he had been cataloging since the square, was now simply and completely a smile real. The kind that required nothing and performed nothing and was just the face of a person who is, in this moment, entirely where they belong. Thomas looked at her and felt the full weight of everything, 3 years of emptiness and the long return from it. Sarah's presence in the house and in his memory and in the garden they were going to plant, Caldwell and the ranchers and the courtroom and the drive and the $44,000 and Buck's settled sound from the open barn door and the ledger and the fence post and the square and 4 words spoken in front of a whole town that had changed the direction of everything, all of it, simultaneous and specific and real, settled into something that had no name adequate to it except the simple fact of being alive in a way he had stopped believing was available to him. He said. Thomas, she said back, with a patience that contained everything it had always contained and more. Love you, he said. I know, she said. I love you too. She said it the way she said everything that was true plainly. Decoration, without the performance of the feeling, simply the fact of it, offered across a kitchen table in a house that had stopped being silent and started being home. And when in the following April, Thomas built the beds from lumber he milled himself, fitting with the careful precision he brought to physical work, had always been the language in which he was most articulate. Amelia designed the layout. She had drawn it out across the winter in the margins of ranch ledgers, plant names written in her precise handwriting alongside spacing notes and soil amendments and the particular requirements of each variety. Sarah's corner held the flowers Sarah had liked. Thomas told Amelia which ones goes, and she sourced the seeds through a catalog in Billings. And they planted that section. They worked in a quiet that was different from all the other silences, full rather than empty, rather than separate. At one point, Amelia sat back on her heels and looked at what they'd planted and said, she was right about leaving the barn door open. She was right about most things, Thomas said. You, Amelia said. About different things. He looked at her. I'm right about some things too, she said, preemptively. You're right about more than some things. I know, she said, but it's important to me that we establish this as a balanced arrangement. He leaned over and kissed her temple, which made her briefly and genuinely flustered, in the way she occasionally was when affection arrived before she had her practical expression fully assembled, and which he found he would never stop finding remarkable. Balanced arrangement, he agreed. They finished the garden by noon and stood and looked at it, the whole thing, beds and the borders, and Sarah's corner with its carefully planted seeds that would not show themselves for 4 weeks but were already there, in the ground, doing the slow invisible work that precedes everything worth having. Frank Ortega came by that afternoon, as he had started doing every couple of weeks, the way good neighbors do when the distance between them has been repaired. His wife, Margaret, who brought a pie, and they sat on the porch and talked about the spring grazing and the county's new administrative oversight committee, which had been formed partly as a result of the case and which Frank had been asked to chair. He had accepted with the deep reluctance of a man who has avoided civic responsibility his entire adult life and has run out of good reasons to keep avoiding it. "Put me into it," he said, and the she was obvious. "I made a reasonable argument," Amelia said. "She made an unreasonable argument, very reasonably," Frank said, which is her particular skill, as I'm sure you've noticed. Thomas said, with great seriousness, "I've noticed." Amelia looked at both of them with the expression of a woman who is deciding whether to be annoyed or amused and is landing much resistance on the latter. When Frank and Margaret left as the afternoon went long, Thomas and Amelia sat on the porch steps in the same configuration they'd occupied the night before the hearing, and the night before that had been weeks and weeks ago, and also felt like yesterday, the way significant moments telescope time. Willow Creek was different now. Transformed real places don't transform, they shift by degrees, gradually, and sometimes grudgingly and always imperfectly. But different. The story of what had happened had done what real stories do in small communities. It had worked its way into the understanding of things, altered the way certain situations were looked at. East made some conversations possible that hadn't been before. Women who had stood in the selection day line with Amelia, some of them had come to see her. Not formally, not with ceremony, just the way women find each other in small towns when the finding matters. Ellen Garrett from the hardware store now spoke to Thomas with the restored ease of a friendship that had been repaired rather than replaced. And the woman who had stood alone at the end of the line are visible, back straight, waiting for something that everyone had decided wasn't coming for her. That woman was known in Willow Creek now. Not as Thomas Walker's wife, not as the woman who had been at the selection, by any of the frames that people had tried to put around her. Known as herself, for what she had done and how she had done it and who she was when she did it. It was not complete. No story is complete in the way that stories in books are complete, with every question answered and every wound healed, and the last page ending at the exactly right moment. Real life continues past every resolution into the next set of difficulties. Amelia Hart Walker, who was the most honest person Thomas had ever known, would have been the first to say so. There were still hard months ahead. The ranch's margins were still careful. Legal aftermaths still had threads to close. There were still people in Willow Creek who had made up their minds about her and would not change them, because that is the nature of some minds. But Amelia had stopped waiting for the complete version. She had learned through the fence posts and the ledgers and the courtroom and the photograph face-up on the kitchen table that the complete version was not the point. Point was the choosing. Every day, the choosing. Thomas understood this now, too. He had not understood it for 3 years, during which he had confused grief with the end of choosing, had lived in the specific paralysis of a man who believed the best of his life was behind him and that the responsible thing was to manage what remained without expecting more from it. He had been wrong. He knew the precise moment he had discovered he was wrong, standing in a selection line, looking at a woman the whole town had agreed to overlook, and feeling something in himself decide that the whole town was making a mistake. It was the best decision he had ever made without knowing he was making it. Sat on the porch as the evening came in, and the October light, still amber, gold, still extravagant in its generosity, laid itself across the land that was theirs, the garden that was growing, the ranch that had been saved not by luck or charity, but by the painstaking, unglamorous, entirely real work of two people who had decided that this was worth saving and had acted accordingly. Made his sound from the open barn. He settled, Amelia said. Yes, Thomas agreed. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. I was doing what Montana skies do at the end of a clear October day, which is to say that it was being unreasonably beautiful in the way of things that don't know they're being looked at. Miss, she said, I'm glad you walked across that square. He looked down at her. Looking at the land, he said, every day. She nodded, and they sat in the particular quiet of two people who have said what needed to be said and do not need to say it again immediately. Who have built something real between them and know it and do not need to announce it. Nobody wanted had become the woman without whom nothing worked. And who had given up on love had discovered that love, real love, that is built from honesty and work, and the willingness to be fully seen, does not ask permission before it arrives, and does not wait for you to be ready, does not care what the town thinks, and does not diminish the people who came before, and is not afraid of scars. It simply chooses. Every morning it simply chooses. And that the choosing is everything.